Daniel Hayes stood beneath the glass entrance of Hawthorne Global with rain dripping from his coat and his 11-year-old daughter pressed close to his side. He had already been refused twice. He had already explained that he wasn't asking for money, a job, or charity. He only needed 5 minutes with Victoria Hawthorne. But when the CEO finally stepped out of the elevator, she looked at Daniel's worn shoes, Emma's peeling sneaker, and the old recorder in his hand, and made her decision before he could finish one sentence. Remove them. 2 security guards took Daniel by the arms. Employees stopped to watch. Emma's face burned with embarrassment as they were escorted through the lobby and pushed outside into the rain. Daniel didn't argue. He only pulled his daughter beneath the narrow awning and whispered, "We tried. That's all we could do." Then Emma noticed something through the glass. Victoria was still standing there, watching them. Emma reached into her backpack and pressed play on the recorder. Static cracked through the lobby speakers. Then the voice of Richard Hawthorne, the company's dead founder, filled the entire building. "Victoria, if you had Daniel Hayes thrown out, then you have already made the mistake I feared most." Victoria froze. But the next words were even worse. "Before you judge that man, ask him what he gave up to save this company, and why I made sure nobody ever knew." For several seconds, nobody moved. The rain struck the glass walls of Hawthorne Global in soft, steady sheets, blurring the city beyond them. Inside the lobby, more than 30 employees stood frozen between elevators, reception desks, and polished marble columns. Outside, Daniel Hayes remained under the narrow awning with one arm around Emma's shoulders. He had heard Richard's words before, but never like this. Never echoing through the lobby of the company Richard had built. Never while dozens of strangers stared at him as if he had suddenly become someone important. Daniel looked down at the recorder in Emma's hand. "You weren't supposed to play that part," he said quietly. Emma swallowed. "I thought she should hear it." Through the glass, Victoria Hawthorne slowly turned toward the nearest security guard. "Open the doors." The guard hesitated. "Miss Hawthorne, the board is waiting upstairs." "I said open the doors." The lock clicked. Cold rain blew into the lobby as the doors slid apart. Victoria stood several feet inside, her expression controlled, but the hand holding her phone had tightened around it. "Bring them back in." Daniel didn't move. One of the guards stepped forward. "Sir?" Daniel looked at Victoria through the open doorway. "You already made your decision," he said. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. She wasn't used to being answered that way, especially by someone standing in a wet coat with no appointment and no influence. "I'm changing it." Daniel gave the smallest shake of his head. "No. You're reacting to your father's voice." A few employees exchanged surprised looks. Victoria stepped closer. "My father just said you gave something up to save this company." Daniel's face revealed nothing. "He said a lot of things near the end." "Then come inside and explain what he meant." "I didn't come here to explain myself." "Then why did you come?" Daniel reached inside his coat and pulled out a weathered brown envelope protected by a clear plastic sleeve. "To give you this." Victoria stared at it. Her father's handwriting was visible across the front. "For Victoria. When she is ready." Her breath caught. She recognized the slant of every letter. Richard had written her name that way on birthday cards, college letters, and notes he left beside her breakfast when he had to leave before sunrise. Victoria took one step forward. Daniel moved the envelope back toward his chest. "You can have it when I know you're ready to read it." Her expression hardened again. "You don't get to decide whether I'm ready." "Your father believed I did." The words landed harder than Daniel intended. Victoria's face changed. Not with anger. With hurt. For one brief second, she looked less like the powerful CEO whose picture appeared on magazine covers and more like a daughter who had just discovered her father had trusted a stranger with something he had never trusted her to hold. Then the moment disappeared. She turned to the crowd. "Everyone back to work." No one moved quickly enough. Victoria raised her voice. "Now." Employees scattered toward elevators and hallways. The receptionist lowered her eyes. The security guards stepped away from Daniel. Only one person remained near the cleaning cart at the far wall. An elderly janitor with silver hair and a tired face. Walter Collins. He had been staring at Daniel since the recording began. Now he slowly walked toward the open doors. "Danny?" Daniel turned. His guarded expression softened. "Mr. Collins." Walter stopped a few feet away, his eyes shining. "I thought you left town." "I almost did." Walter looked at Emma. "You must be Emma." She nodded cautiously. "You were this small the last time I saw you." He held his hand near his knee. "Your mother used to bring you to the hospital in a yellow blanket." Daniel's jaw tightened. Emma looked up at him. "You knew Mom?" Walter's smile faded into something gentler. "Only a little." Victoria watched the exchange. "You know him too?" Walter looked at her as if the answer should have been obvious. "Your father trusted him." "That isn't what I asked." Walter's eyes hardened. It was a small change, but it surprised everyone who saw it. He had spent nearly 4 decades making himself almost invisible inside that building. He cleaned after executives, emptied their trash, and listened to conversations people assumed he couldn't understand. But now he stood upright. "I know enough to tell you that Richard Hawthorne would have been ashamed of what happened in this lobby." Victoria's face went still. "Be careful, Walter." "I've been careful for 38 years. The words were calm. That made them more dangerous. Daniel stepped between them slightly. "Mr. Collins, this isn't necessary." Walter looked at him. "They threw you into the rain." "I'm fine." "You always say that." Daniel said nothing. Walter glanced at Emma's sneaker, where the sole had begun to separate near the toe. Then he noticed the small paper bag in her backpack. "Did you two eat breakfast?" Emma looked at her father before answering. Daniel answered for her. "We're fine." Walter let out a humorless breath. "You haven't changed." Victoria noticed Daniel's hand drift toward his coat pocket, pressing against something inside. Not money. Not keys. Something he was checking to make sure was still there. The recorder. "Come upstairs," she said. Daniel looked at her. 5 minutes, Victoria continued. "You give me the letter. You explain the recording. Then you can leave." "No." The answer came so quickly that it stunned her. "Excuse me?" "Your father gave me 3 instructions. The first was never to give you the letter while you were angry. The second was never to give it to you while you were afraid. Right now, you're both." Victoria stared at him. "And the third?" Daniel looked toward the elevators. "He said I would know when it was time." A man in a dark suit stepped out of the private elevator. Martin Graves. Senior board member. Richard Hawthorne's oldest business partner. He took in the scene, the open doors, Daniel's wet coat, Victoria's pale expression, Walter standing beside the cleaning cart. Then he noticed the envelope. His face changed immediately. "Where did you get that?" Daniel turned toward him. Martin crossed the lobby faster than anyone had ever seen him move. "That handwriting," he said. "That's Richard's." Victoria looked at him. "You knew about this?" Martin didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel. "Who are you?" "Daniel Hayes." Martin stopped. The color drained from his face. Walter saw it. Victoria saw it too. "You know him," she said. Martin's mouth tightened. "No." But the answer came too late. Daniel studied him carefully. "You were at St. Matthew's Hospital," he said. Martin took a step back. Victoria looked between them. "What happened at St. Matthew's?" Nobody answered. Emma, still holding the recorder, glanced down at its small screen. A red light had begun blinking. She pressed one button. The recorder crackled again. Richard Hawthorne's voice filled the lobby for a second time. But this message wasn't for Victoria. It was for Martin. "Martin, if you're hearing this, then Daniel kept his promise." The older man closed his eyes. The recording continued. "Now it's time you kept yours." Richard Hawthorne's voice echoed through the silent lobby. "Martin, if you're hearing this, then Daniel kept his promise." Martin Graves slowly removed his glasses. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the man who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. The recorder continued. "Now it's time you keep yours." The message ended. Silence. No explanation. No details. Only another unanswered question. Victoria looked from Martin to Daniel. "What promise?" Neither man answered. Martin finally spoke. Not here. Victoria frowned. Then where? My office. No, Daniel said calmly. Martin looked at him. I've spent 4 years keeping Richard's promises. Daniel's voice remained steady. I'm not starting to break them today. Martin lowered his eyes. He understood exactly what Daniel meant. Victoria folded her arms. Someone needs to explain what's happening. Daniel looked toward Emma. She was shivering. Her red coat had absorbed enough rain that the sleeves were beginning to darken. Without saying a word, Daniel took off his own jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. He remained standing in nothing but a faded blue work shirt with one carefully stitched elbow. Victoria noticed it immediately. Not because it was old. Because it had been repaired by hand. Someone had taken the time to save it instead of replacing it. She found herself wondering how many other things in Daniel's life had simply been repaired because replacing them wasn't an option. Walter quietly picked up his cleaning cart. Emma. She looked at him. Come with me for a minute. Daniel nodded. Walter led Emma toward the employee cafe just around the corner. As soon as they disappeared from sight, Walter reached into his own wallet. Inside were 3 folded $20 bills. He quietly placed one into the vending machine. Emma watched. I can pay you back. Walter smiled. No. My dad says we don't take things we can't return. Walter's eyes became moist. Your father once returned something nobody else ever could. Emma looked confused. What? Walter hesitated. Then shook his head. That's his story to tell. He bought her a bowl of hot tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. Emma stared at the tray. I've never eaten lunch here. Walter chuckled. Neither have I. She smiled for the first time that morning. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, Victoria finally broke the silence. My father said Daniel gave something up to save this company. She looked directly at Martin. What did he mean? Martin rubbed his forehead. I was hoping Richard would never leave that recording. Daniel quietly answered. He almost didn't. Victoria turned. You knew. He recorded it 6 days before he died. Martin closed his eyes. So he really expected this day. Daniel nodded once. He planned everything. Victoria looked at the envelope again. I don't understand. Daniel answered honestly. You aren't supposed to yet. That answer irritated her. You keep speaking in riddles. I'm speaking exactly the way your father asked me to. Before Victoria could respond, the private elevator doors opened again. 3 board members stepped out. One of them looked annoyed. Victoria. We've delayed this meeting long enough. Another noticed Daniel. Who's he? Martin answered before anyone else could. A guest. The director frowned. Our board meetings aren't open to guests. They are today. The room became quiet again. Everyone looked at Martin. He had never once challenged board procedure. Not once. Victoria noticed it too. Something had frightened him. Or perhaps someone. The directors exchanged uneasy glances. We'll wait upstairs. As they disappeared again, Victoria slowly exhaled. Martin. He looked at her. What aren't you telling me? He looked toward Daniel. Daniel gave a small nod. Martin understood. There was a winter, he began quietly, about 5 years ago. Your father collapsed during a board presentation. Victoria's eyes widened. I never knew. He didn't want you to. Martin continued. We thought it was exhaustion. But after the hospital... He stopped. His voice caught. Daniel looked down. Martin forced himself to continue. The doctors told Richard he might not have much time left. Victoria felt her heartbeat quicken. He never told me. No. He wanted one last chance to fix something before he died. What? Martin looked directly at Daniel. Him. Victoria frowned. My father barely knew him. Daniel finally spoke. That's what everyone believed. Another silence. Martin slowly walked toward the massive lobby windows overlooking the city. You know why Richard trusted Daniel? Victoria waited. Martin smiled sadly. Because Daniel was the only person in Richard's life who didn't care he was Richard Hawthorne. Victoria looked confused. What do you mean? Martin laughed softly. Everyone wanted something from Richard. Investors. Politicians. Friends. Even family sometimes. But Daniel, he looked back toward him, was the only man who ever looked Richard Hawthorne in the eye and treated him like an ordinary old mechanic. Victoria blinked. My father wasn't a mechanic. No. Martin smiled. But for almost 18 months. He pretended to be one. Victoria stared at Daniel. Daniel didn't deny it. Martin continued. Every Thursday evening, Richard would leave this building through the service exit. He'd change clothes. He'd drive across town. And he'd spend 3 hours inside a small community garage. Victoria whispered, My father never fixed cars. Daniel finally smiled. No. He mostly handed me the wrong wrench. Martin laughed through wet eyes. But they talked. About everything. Life. Regret. Family. Failure. Victoria felt as if every memory she had of her father was quietly rearranging itself. She looked at Daniel. So, you became friends? Daniel answered. No. He became my friend. Before Victoria could ask another question, Walter returned with Emma. Emma's cheeks had regained a little color. She quietly carried half of her sandwich wrapped in a napkin. She walked straight to Daniel. I saved this for you. Daniel smiled. You should eat it. I already did. She gently placed it into his hand anyway. You always save some for me. Daniel looked away for a moment. Not because he was embarrassed. Because he suddenly couldn't trust himself to speak. Victoria watched the exchange. Something inside her shifted. Not because of Richard's recording. Not because of Martin. Not because of the letter. But because she had never seen anyone share something they so clearly needed themselves. At that exact moment, the receptionist hurried toward them. Ms. Hawthorne. She sounded nervous. The reporters are here. Victoria frowned. What reporters? They somehow found out that Richard Hawthorne's voice was just played inside the building. Another employee rushed over. And social media? It's everywhere. Martin looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the floor. Richard's final promise was no longer just a private family matter. It had become national news. For the next 20 minutes, every news station in the city tried to confirm the same rumor. Richard Hawthorne's voice had somehow been heard inside Hawthorne Global. No one knew why. No one knew who Daniel Hayes was. But employees had already begun posting short clips from inside the lobby. Most of them ended before Richard said anything important, which only made people more curious. Victoria closed the blinds in her office. For the first time in years, she wanted the outside world to wait. She looked toward Daniel. Before another interruption, tell me how you met my father. Daniel was quiet for several seconds. Then he smiled faintly. It wasn't impressive. Martin chuckled. Actually, it was. 5 years earlier, Daniel was working alone inside a small neighborhood garage on the edge of Portland. It wasn't even really a business anymore. Just one service bay, one lift, and a coffee machine that barely worked. Emma was 6. She sat at a folding table coloring pictures while Daniel replaced brakes on an old pickup truck. Late that afternoon, an old silver sedan rolled into the garage. The driver stepped out wearing faded jeans, work boots, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to hide his face. Transmission sounds terrible, the man said. Daniel listened for less than 30 seconds. Then smiled. Transmission's fine. The stranger looked surprised. It is. It's your left wheel bearing. You can hear that? I can hear that you almost paid for a transmission you don't need. The old man laughed. Most shops would have charged me anyway. Daniel shrugged. Then you came to the wrong shop. Back in the present, Victoria listened without blinking. My father never told me this. Daniel smiled. He told me later he almost left after I refused to overcharge him. Martin nodded. Richard said, I finally found someone who wasn't impressed by my money because he didn't know I had any. Daniel continued. He kept coming back. Sometimes with car problems. Sometimes with no problems at all. Victoria smiled through watery eyes. So, he lied just to talk to you. Daniel laughed softly. Pretty much. Even Martin laughed. He became terrible at pretending things were broken. The room relaxed for the first time that day. Until Victoria asked one question. When did you discover who he really was? Daniel answered immediately. 3 months later. How? He forgot his phone. I answered it. What happened? The caller said, Mr. Hawthorne, your board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Victoria covered her mouth. And? I handed him the phone. What did he say? Daniel smiled. He looked embarrassed. Flashback. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. I suppose I should explain. Daniel handed him the phone. You don't owe me one. Aren't you angry? No. You knew I wasn't honest. Daniel shrugged. You lied about your name. You didn't lie about who you are. Richard stared at him. No investor, no politician, no executive had ever answered him that way. Present. Victoria slowly sat down. I've spent years wondering who my father really was outside this building. Daniel looked toward the old photograph lying on her desk. The same man. He just laughed more. A soft knock interrupted them. Walter entered carrying an old cardboard storage box. I think these belong here. Martin immediately recognized it. Richard's personal archive. Victoria frowned. I've never seen that. He asked me to keep it. Walter placed it carefully on the table. Inside were dozens of ordinary things. Restaurant receipts, coffee cups, old baseball tickets, handwritten grocery lists. Victoria looked confused. My father saved all this? Walter smiled. He wasn't saving things. He was saving memories. Daniel carefully picked up an old paper coffee cup. On the side, Richard had written with a black marker, Best mechanic in Portland. Daniel laughed. I told him to stop writing on everything. Walter smiled. He never listened. Emma picked up another item. A tiny plastic dinosaur. Dad. You remember this? Daniel froze. Oh. I thought we lost that. Emma smiled. I cried for 2 days. Victoria looked confused. My father kept her toy? Daniel nodded. It fell out of Emma's backpack one day. I told Richard we'd find another one. Walter quietly answered. He drove across 3 stores until he found the exact same dinosaur. Emma looked at the toy. He never told me. Daniel smiled. He said heroes aren't supposed to announce themselves. Victoria looked down. Her father had done all these little things, yet never mentioned them. Not once. Martin slowly opened another envelope from inside the archive. His face immediately changed. Daniel noticed. What is it? Martin looked toward Victoria. This was never supposed to leave Richard's office. Victoria took the envelope. Across the front, in Richard's handwriting, were 6 words. Open only if Daniel refuses. The room became silent. Victoria slowly opened it. Inside was another letter. But only 1 page. She began reading aloud. Victoria, if you're reading this, Daniel has tried to disappear again. Daniel lowered his eyes. Richard knew him too well. Victoria continued. He'll tell you he doesn't deserve recognition. Don't believe him. He believes good people should stay invisible. That's exactly why people like him should never be forgotten. Victoria's voice cracked. She looked toward Daniel. You plan to leave after today? Daniel nodded. Yes. You never wanted anyone to know? No. Why? Daniel smiled. Because the promise wasn't about me. It was about your father. Before anyone spoke again, the office phone rang. Victoria answered. Her assistant sounded terrified. Ms. Hawthorne. The entire board is here. They've called an emergency vote. Victoria frowned. A vote? Yes. They're demanding you hand over Richard's letters immediately. Martin slowly stood. His expression darkened. I was afraid this would happen. Victoria looked at him. Afraid of what? Martin answered quietly. Because not everyone wants Richard's final truth to be heard. The executive boardroom had never felt so divided. 12 directors sat around the long walnut table. Some looked uneasy. Some looked impatient. Others looked angry. Outside the glass walls, reporters were already gathering across the street. Inside, Richard Hawthorne's final words still lingered over everyone. Victoria entered first. Daniel followed quietly. Emma stayed beside Walter near the doorway. Martin closed the door behind them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Director Charles Bennett broke the silence. Victoria, you've canceled today's meeting. You've allowed a stranger into confidential discussions. And now the media is outside asking questions. He looked directly at Daniel. Who exactly is this man? Daniel answered calmly. My name is Daniel Hayes. I repair things. Charles frowned. That's not what I asked. Daniel smiled politely. It's the most honest answer I have. Several directors exchanged confused looks. Martin almost smiled. Richard had once said, Daniel always answers the question people should have asked. Charles folded his hands. Victoria, we're requesting immediate possession of Richard's letters. They're company property. Victoria answered without hesitation. No. Another director leaned forward. They concern the founder. They concern his family, Victoria replied. They concern his values. And they concern promises that were never made to this board. The room grew quiet. Charles stood. If you refuse, we'll begin a vote regarding your leadership. Victoria looked around the table. Not one expression surprised her. She had expected this. Daniel quietly stepped forward. Please don't. Everyone looked at him. I didn't come here to create problems. I came here to finish one. Charles answered sharply. Then perhaps it's time you leave. Daniel nodded. I plan to. Emma looked at him. Dad. He smiled. It's all right. He turned back toward Victoria. Your father asked me to deliver the letters. I've done that. My part is finished. He reached into his worn leather bag. Slowly, carefully, he removed one final object. An old brass key. Walter gasped. Martin closed his eyes. Victoria looked confused. My father gave you a key? Daniel nodded. He said if you ever truly understood the letters, you'd know where it belongs. Martin spoke quietly. The workshop. Victoria looked at him. What workshop? Walter smiled sadly. The place Richard loved more than his office. 30 minutes later, the four of them stood inside a small community garage across town. Nothing about it looked special. Old tools, concrete floors, oil stains, a faded American flag hanging from one wall. Emma looked around. This is where Grandpa Richard came? Daniel smiled. Every Thursday. Victoria slowly walked through the room. Everything felt strangely alive. An old radio still sat on the shelf. Coffee mugs remained exactly where Richard used to leave them. Even the workbench looked untouched. Daniel walked toward an old steel toolbox in the corner. The brass key fit perfectly. Inside, there was no money, no stock certificates, no hidden fortune, only a wooden box. Victoria carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of handwritten index cards. Every card contained one lesson Richard had learned from Daniel. She picked up the first. Never assume someone's worth from their clothes. The second. Quiet people often carry the loudest burdens. The third. Emma always shares half her lunch with her father even when she's still hungry herself. Victoria stopped reading. Tears rolled down her face. Her father hadn't been documenting business ideas. He had been documenting humanity. Walter quietly picked up another card. Asterisk, the day this company stops respecting ordinary people, it will stop deserving extraordinary success. Martin whispered. That's Richard. Daniel smiled softly. No, that's who Richard wanted to become. Victoria slowly closed the box. Then she looked toward Daniel. My father trusted you more than almost anyone. Daniel shook his head. He trusted people. I just happened to be one of them. She laughed through tears. You're impossible to thank. Daniel looked toward Emma. My wife used to say, the best way to thank someone is to become the kind of person who helps the next one. Victoria stood silently for a long moment. Then she made her decision. 3 weeks later, every employee at Hawthorne Global received an invitation. No cameras. No reporters. No investors. Only employees. Mechanics. Receptionists. Drivers. Security guards. Janitors. Executives. Everyone stood together in the main lobby. Victoria stepped to the podium. Behind her hung a new bronze plaque. She didn't begin with company profits or future plans. Instead she said, my father spent his life building this company. But one quiet man reminded him why he wanted to build it in the first place. She looked toward Daniel. He stood in the back, exactly where he had wanted, trying not to be noticed. Victoria smiled. Daniel, would you come up here? He hesitated. Emma nudged him gently. I think Grandpa Richard would. Daniel laughed quietly. I think you're right. He walked to the front. Victoria unveiled the plaque. It didn't contain Richard's name, nor hers. It simply read, character is measured by how you treat people who can do nothing for you. Richard Hawthorne. Below it in much smaller letters. Inspired by a promise quietly kept by Daniel Hayes. The entire lobby stood in silence. One employee began clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, every mechanic, every receptionist, every security guard, every executive, every board member was standing. Not because Daniel had become famous. Not because he had become rich. But because, for the first time, they understood what Richard Hawthorne had spent 18 months trying to learn. Emma reached over and held her father's hand. Dad. Yeah. I think Mom would have liked Grandpa Richard. Daniel looked at the plaque one last time. Then smiled. I think they would have been good friends. He squeezed Emma's hand. Together, they quietly walked out of the building. Just as they had planned that morning. Still carrying the same old bag. Still taking the city bus home. Still expecting nothing. And somehow, leaving behind something that would outlive every board meeting, every quarterly report, and every CEO who would ever walk through those doors.